What is determinacy? In philosophy, we find determinacy refers to the quality of being definite, precise, or specified in some way. It often comes up in discussions about meaning, truth, logic, metaphysics, and ontology, and many more subdomains like aesthetics, religion, and so forth. So, while philosophy asks the questions of why things are the way they are, or how reality hangs together, it almost always inspects the tools with which it poses its questions. So philosophers aren't happy just asking, what is that thing that's doing this other thing in the world? We want to also figure out, well, how do we come to know that thing in the first place? And are we actually accurately observing that thing doing this event or having this activity? So when inquiring into the nature of things, philosophers invariably take into account not only so-called the contents, but also the very form of their thought. And that is what this question of determinacy helps us home into. So we have everyday determinacy, right? Our world is made up of all things that are determined. Like there's this table, there's this cup with a liquid inside, there's coffee. It's delicious, right? All of these things are determinate, and you almost never go around anywhere without some sort of determinacy, something being determined. So it becomes really difficult to imagine a world or anything or even a thought otherwise, right? So here are some more examples. The glass appears red, but it's really transparent. The fluffy dog's name is Henry, and water boils, etc., and so on, right? All of these things are determinate, right? So determinacy is almost like the water in which the fish swim. You have this example from David Foster Wallace, I think. He said in a talk, an older fish comes by two younger fish, and he says, "Water is nice today, isn't it?" And the two fish nod, but after he passes, they ask, "What is water?" In a little bit of the same way, we struggle with, well, what is determinacy, right? An older philosopher comes by you on the street and says, "Well, determinacy is very nice today, isn't it?" And you're like, "What do you mean?" So it covers a wide spectrum of concepts that we otherwise use, such as judgment, how we come to experience things, essence, causality, and inference, and many more. Right now, we're getting into a little bit more technical philosophical concepts, but really, it's implied in all of these, right? Since they would not work or make sense without it, right? So judgment and essence is already something determinate, right? To judge, you specify something, a subject and a predicate, and essence, you specify sort of relations or something that's a kernel that is beyond what immediately appears, and so on and so forth. So something is definite in all of these cases, right? And they pretty much take it for granted that it's just there. So it becomes difficult to pin it down. What exactly is one referring to? And it seems we must evoke determinacy before we can justify it, and that seems circular, right? We don't seem to get around it in any meaningful way. So, to put this a different way, trying to explain what a rule is, following Wittgenstein, already assumes rule following. So it's kind of baked into the concept that you already must have the concept before you can ask what it is. So to talk about justified determinacy, we have to already presuppose a determinate framework or meaning and distinction. But such implicit notions are not uncommon, philosophers find, right? Concepts like being in Heidegger or judgment from Kant are already at work in our world and our world and understanding before we put in the work to make them explicit. So we already go about our world or in being, judging and having an experience before we really understand what experience as such is, or what being as such is, or what reality as such is. So that doesn't need to be a problem, the circularity. So let's look at how particular philosophers deal with determinacy. So for Aristotle, determinacy is a condition of intelligibility, right? Not just a conclusion. And here we can see this implicitness more at work. So if we find that things are in themselves not only determinate, but the sources of any determinacy. So, quote from Aristotle, everything except primary substances is either predicable of a primary substance or present in a primary substance. This becomes evident by a reference to particular instances which occur. Animal is predicated of the species man, and therefore of the individual man, for if it were no individual man of whom it could be predicated, it could not be predicated of the species man at all. So for Aristotle, everything boils down to actual existing individuals who occupy certain behaviors, traits, properties, and so on and so forth, that then we abstract or create classes out of, or concepts, you might even say. And that is how we build determinacy, or things are rendered intelligible. But for Aristotle, it's important it all is sourced from actual existing individuals. It's really the individuals that is kind of has primacy here, and kind of gives Aristotle an empiricist edge in this case. But in Kant, we find that intelligibility is a condition for determinacy, or that we find that things are not strictly given as determinate. It's not just a one-on-one relation, they're just like, but they are made so by our faculties, or so-called categories of our mind. And so Kant writes, quote, up until now it has been assumed that all our cognition must conform to the objects, right? Everything we know must be something that conforms to something out there. This is kind of the Aristotelian aspect, right? Everything we know is sourced from determinate things out there. But then Kant goes on, but all attempts to find out something about them a priori meaning before the fact, right, before experience, through concepts that would extend our cognition have, on this presupposition, come to nothing. Hence, let us once try whether we do not get farther with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition, which would agree better with the requested possibility of an a priori cognition of them, which is to establish something about objects before they are given to us. So here Kant sort of looks at it differently by posing the question, well, it's not so much that our minds map onto determinacy out there, but as things out there map onto determinacy already built in within our minds. And these determinacies come to be known as categories in a more technical sense when we sort of begin to analyze these determinacies. And they are, in as far as Kant's concerned, sort of built into the mind and made available to us as we go around and experience things. But available to us in a sense that it's not of our choosing, they just snap onto things out there, right? So you might then ask, well, isn't there sort of some sort of connection or relation? Yes, and the picture gets complicated, so we're gonna subtly leave that aside. But it all kind of boils down to, in Kant, in the transcendental unity of apperception, which is that unity through which all of the manifold given in an intuition is united in a concept of the object. So that's Kant talk for we are the ones who make things determinate, and it occurs in us spontaneously with the mental resources of the mind. So we can then therefore analyze this apart from experience, because if we already have much of the tools, then we can inspect these tools before we even start to look at things out in the world. We can think about them, philosophize about them, speculate about these tools, and figure them out how they function logically. So that's the Kantian way of looking at how determinacy emerges. Well, we can just look at our mental apparatus, and that's how things become determinate in our experience. Moving still further into Hegel, the nature of determinacy as such cannot be taken for granted, but must be explicitly developed and justified. So, quote, the determinations must first arise from the movement of being itself and receive their definitions and justification by virtue of it. So, in Hegel, we focus more. We kind of almost loop back to Aristotle, where we focus on the source of determinacy itself, but not in the world. In fact, not even in the mind, as if we're going to be very strict. We are really just focusing on the concept of determinacy in Hegel, and he thinks that, that is in of itself very meaningful, and we can unpack and develop that onto itself. So the world and its things are obviously determinate, but to really figure out the nature of determinacy, how determinate beings relate to one another, Hegel thinks we must become more self-critical than Kant and suspend judgment about determinacy as such and ask, why does anything become determinate? Right? Never mind whether something becomes determinate for us in our experience as human beings, which is kind of the Kantian standpoint. Why is anything determinate in the first place? Can we think of anything that is less than determinate? Is such a thing possible? Is reality less than determinate? Is the world less than determinate? Is being less than determinate? Or is nothing less than determinate? So, to put more fuel on the fire here, here's a quote from Hegel, quote, Kant's treatment of the categories came up empty. So categories here being those determinacies that are now relevant in this philosophical context. But they all sort of are part of our journey of figuring out, well, how do we come to know things? How do we come to know things specifically? This is what it's all about. If there was to be real progress in philosophy, Hegel claims it was necessary that the interest of thought should be drawn to the consideration of the formal side of the I, of consciousness as such, that is, of the abstract reference of a subjective awareness to an object. And in this way, the path should be opened for the cognition of the infinite form, that is, of the concept. So, there is a little bit of a Hegelian sort of twist and turn here. What is abstract reference of a subjective awareness to an object? Hegel just means that we are just focusing on the object as such here, not as it is part of any context, such as is it part of the world, is it a mental idea, what have you. No, we're just focusing on the object in its formality, and that we're in the objects in question here are specifically categories. So all that's to say that we're just looking at the category as such, and we're looking at its form as such, or in other words, we're just looking at the concept. Never mind how the concept relates to empirical intuitions, time and space, and what have you. What is the concept? So, continuing, yet in order to arrive at this cognition, the finite determinateness in which the form is as I, as consciousness, must be shed. The form, when thought out in its purity, will then have within itself the capacity to determine itself. That is, to give itself a content, and to give it as a necessary content, as a system of thought determinations. So, it's Hegel adds in a lot of sort of prerequisites here that become sort of staples of his philosophy. We must shed the finite determinateness in which the form as I, as consciousness, right, when we're thinking about these categories, these concepts. The form, when thought out in its purity, this is kind of the key point. It's the purity of the concepts that is important. We're thinking of them, whatever it is, determinacy in this case, just in its own self, right? And we are asking the question, can there be something that's less than determinate? Hegel thinks there is. And Hegel thinks that in thinking about this, we can develop, or it will turn out to develop, a content of its own that will be determinate, that will turn out to be determinate. But in this, if Hegel is right, we will sort of see a logical evolution of going from indeterminacy to determinacy. And we should understand really what is the precise point at which one gives way to another. Because already in me speaking about these things, in these terms, we have a bit of a problem. Because isn't just announcing indeterminacy a kind of determinacy? Well, yes, and Hegel recognizes that. So he has his own sort of strategy of getting us to not think of determinacy, but think of something that's less than determinate. And from of that, arrive at determinacy, but from within thought itself. So that's all for today. I hope I hope this was interesting and useful. The next question you might ask yourself is, well, what is the difference between determinacy and category? So I'll catch you all in the next one. Thank you and bye-bye.